The gavel slammed down like thunder, sharp, cold, final. $250 million. Judge Amelia Barrett said, her voice echoing through the marble and mahogany courtroom like the snap of a winter wind. This court finds you, Senator Thomas Kennedy, guilty of contempt, obstruction, and deliberate misuse of federal funds. You are hereby fined accordingly. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Reporters froze mid-scribble, cameras flickered like lightning bugs in a storm, and the weight of a nation's disbelief settled like dust in the silent wake of that sentence. Kennedy didn't flinch. His blue eyes stayed locked on Judge Barrett, not with hate, not even with anger. Just calm, deep, unnerving calm like the ocean right before a hurricane. It was the biggest moment in a courtroom in 2 decades. A sitting U.S. senator being fined nearly $250 million by a judge known as the Iron Gavel. And yet, within moments, everything began to change because Thomas Kennedy didn't walk out with his head hung low. He stood up and he turned the jury and the entire nation against her. But to understand how it all unraveled, we need to go back. Not to the verdict, but to the quiet moments before the storm. Amelia Barrett had built her life on principle. The daughter of a Mississippi preacher and a schoolteacher, she grew up in a house with 1 bathroom and 1 rule: never lie, not even to yourself. Her childhood was simple but strict. She studied by the kerosene light, read the Constitution like other kids read fairy tales, and decided by age 12 that justice wasn't just a concept. It was a calling. By 38, she'd become the youngest federal judge in the Southern District. By 45, she'd made headlines for sentencing a Wall Street titan to prison for insider trading. By 50, she was whispered about as a future Supreme Court justice. Her courtroom was her cathedral, and the law her scripture. Cold, clear, and unbendable, Senator Thomas Kennedy, on the other hand, was chaos in a suit. Born into wealth, but raised by a mother who battled addiction, Kennedy learned early that power could heal or destroy. He had charm that could peel paint off a wall, and a mind that remembered every name, every betrayal. He got into politics after serving in Afghanistan, where a bullet missed his heart by a breath and left a scar he never showed. His cause, veterans' rights; his flaw, a deep distrust of authority. And now they were standing on opposite sides of the courtroom, not as strangers, but as 2 storms colliding. It started with a scandal, a $700 million federal initiative called Project Valor, designed to modernize veteran health care systems across rural America. Kennedy had been its loudest champion. The funding had gone through and then disappeared into a labyrinth of subcontractors, ghost companies, and shell organizations. When the smoke cleared, over $250 million was unaccounted for, and Senator Kennedy's name was stamped on the authorization. Judge Barrett took the case personally. She'd buried her older brother, a Marine, after his 5th VA cancellation led to a late cancer diagnosis. She'd seen the flag folded, felt the cold steel of loss. For her, this wasn't just about corruption. It was about betrayal. The trial stretched for weeks, a slow, relentless march of damning evidence and polished testimonies. Emails, signatures, wire transfers. Kennedy's defense was that he had no knowledge of the fraud, that he had trusted the system to do its job. But the prosecution argued he'd looked the other way for political gain. When the verdict came, the room held its breath. And when the gavel struck, it was like the exhale of a nation that thought justice had won. But then Kennedy did something no one expected. He asked to address the jury. "I don't deny mistakes were made," Kennedy began, his voice steady but quiet, like a man talking in a church where someone he loved had just been buried. But I need you to know the truth, not the legal truth, the human one." He paused, scanning the 12 faces in the jury box. Ordinary people, construction workers, school teachers, a retired nurse. He didn't look at them like they were strangers. He looked at them like they were his last chance at salvation. "When I came back from Afghanistan, I didn't think I'd make it a year," he said. "I was angry, lost. I slept in my car for 3 weeks because I couldn't sleep indoors without hearing mortars in my dreams. The only thing that pulled me out was the VA counselor in Jackson, who took my call at 2:17 in the morning. He didn't have to, but he did. The courtroom was still. You could hear the soft sob of a woman in the 3rd row. That man saved my life, and ever since, I've tried to repay that debt. Every bill I've backed, every vote I've cast. I pushed Project Valor because I believed in it. Maybe I trusted the wrong people, maybe I missed the signs, but I never took a dime, and I never, ever meant to fail the people who wore the uniform." He turned, finally, to look at Judge Barrett. Their eyes locked, years of grief and principle crashing into each other like waves on granite. "You lost someone. I did too," he said, voice cracking just once. "So maybe we're both here because of ghosts. But that doesn't mean I deserve to be buried with them." The jury deliberated again, unofficially, against protocol, at the urging of the public, the media, and a rare legal clause invoked by Kennedy's lawyers. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about the punishment. 3 days later they returned. Their decision, the fine, was disproportionate. They recommended reduction, with restitution directed to a new, independent oversight committee for veterans' care. Judge Barrett had to relent, and in doing so, she lost something greater than the case, the perception of her infallibility. Overnight, she went from a national hero to a polarizing figure. Some called her courageous, others overreaching. She didn't care what the headlines said, but the silence of her own reflection in the mirror, that was harder. Meanwhile, Kennedy didn't gloat. He disappeared from the spotlight. Instead, he drove cross-country, quietly meeting the very people Project Valor was supposed to help. A PTSD unit in Tulsa, a widow in Cheyenne, a double amputee in Mobile who hadn't seen a VA doctor in 6 months. With every handshake, he rebuilt what politics had stripped from him, trust. But there was another story unfolding too. Miriam Ellis, a whistleblower and former data analyst for the subcontractor firm involved in the scandal, had watched the trial from a distance. Her own testimony had been dismissed early on due to technicalities. She had kept files, data logs, emails that proved Kennedy hadn't initiated the fraud and had, in fact, tried to block funding to one of the shell companies months before the money vanished. She reached out, not to Kennedy, but to Judge Barrett. It was an email, one line in the subject, "I have what you need." Barrett met her in a diner off I-20 in Alabama. No press, no court reporter. Just 2 women and a stack of evidence that would, eventually, not only exonerate Kennedy, but take down 2 sitting federal contractors and a lobbyist who had orchestrated the theft. Barrett handed it off to the Department of Justice, but the moment that stayed with her wasn't the evidence itself. It was what Miriam said just before she left. "You went after the wrong man, but you went after him for the right reasons." That line haunted Barrett and healed her, because sometimes justice isn't about being right. It's about being willing to admit when you've been wrong. Months later, Barrett invited Kennedy to speak at a veterans summit in D.C. They shared the stage. She introduced him not as a defendant, not as a senator, but as someone who refused to let fail be final. The crowd rose, not for a politician, not for a judge, but for 2 people who, in their own ways, had fought for something bigger than themselves and bled for it. The lesson, It's not always the verdict that defines us. It's what we do after the gavel falls, and sometimes the fight for justice begins after the courtroom empties.